Hesquex, Petsia, Chen Spokane, Chad Hamill, Louise Quest. My name is Chad Hamill. I'm Special Advisor to the President on Native American Affairs here at Northern Arizona University. Also a descendant of the Spokane tribe in Washington State. I wanted to thank Chairman Wood, Lem Lemch, for your talk. It's inspiring. Spokane people know a little bit about dispossession. They named the city of Spokane after us and then asked us to leave. Thank you very much. Now head up into the mountains there. But we continue to persevere, practice our ceremonies, speak our language, gather our foods, and sing our songs. So in addition to being special advisor, which is tied to NAU's mission to be the leading university serving Native Americans. Not long ago it was a leading university. We've since changed it to the. It's a goal after all, and that's what we want to accomplish. That certainly involves bringing more Native American students to NAU, but there are many other pieces to that. And one of those pieces is the work that's done in Applied Indigenous Studies. So I'm currently chair of the Department of Applied Indigenous Studies. And the mission of AIS is to provide students with the knowledge and tools to contribute to Native nation building in the 21st century. We've been fortunate enough to recruit Dr. Begay to help us with that effort. So I know you heard a bit about Native nation building earlier. In his work, both within and outside the National Indian Gaming Commission, Jonodev Osceola Chaudhuri has demonstrated the same commitment to strengthening our Native nations. In addition to being chair of the NIGC, Mr. Chaudhuri has served as a lawyer, tribal judge, community organizer, adjunct professor, and author. Before coming to NIGC, Chaudhuri served as senior counselor to the Interior Department's assistant secretary, providing guidance and assistance on a wide range of national policy issues, including Indian gaming, economic development, energy, Alaska affairs, and tribal recognition. In overseeing the primary federal agency responsible for regulating and ensuring the integrity of the $28 billion Indian gaming industry, Chaudhuri has made it a priority to engage in meaningful consultation with tribes. As many of you may know, the 3 state universities in Arizona are in the process of implementing a tribal consultation policy that applies to any research or educational initiatives undertaken on Native lands or with members of an indigenous community. In addition to protecting Native communities and individuals from exploitation, the policy provides an opportunity for state institutions of higher education in Arizona to support, as well as respect, the self-determination and sovereignty of Native nations. Under Mr. Chaudhuri's leadership, self-determination and sovereignty are central to the NIGC's activities, most notably in the NIGC's advocacy for tribal self-regulation. In his co-authored chapter in the book, Recreating the Circle, The Renewal of American Indian Self-Determination, Mr. Chaudhuri also expresses a strong interest in indigenizing legal codes and judicial processes, another critical component of Native nation building. As we take steps forward toward indigenizing NAU, we are particularly interested, as I'm sure you are, in the experience and insights of Mr. Chaudhuri and what he might share with us here today. So please welcome me in joining Mr. Chaudhuri. Join me in welcoming Mr. Chaudhuri to the stage.
Thank you so much, Director Hamill. Absolutely did your research there, and I think I'd forgotten a couple of those points, but I don't have any prepared remarks today. I think the last time I prepared a presentation, a speech, was when I was 16, and I had a typo in the speech, and as I was reading my presentation, I knew it was a typo, but doggone it, it was written on my speech, so I went ahead and read it wrong. So since then, I've never prepared anything. So my intent is to speak from the heart, and as with tradition, I first want to give my thanks. Mado, stungo xg, sagamasi, moga, udmitis. And it's basically just saying, good day, thank you, many blessings to you, many blessings to all of us. May we be of one mind. So it is wonderful, wonderful to be out of DC and to be back in Arizona. Arizona is my home. Many, many thanks to NAU, to CAIED, to Director Osceola, longtime friend and longtime colleague. I'm very honored to be invited to be part of today's Outlook. In addition to that, many thanks to the business school, Dean Ben Sykes and Vice President Keene. This is just a wonderful gathering. More importantly, many thanks for the opportunity to be back in Indian country and to be among so many extraordinary leaders and visionaries, and if I may say, mentors. Looking around the room, it really is humbling to be among so many folks who are so committed to serving the communities and providing better futures for their people and for Indian people as a whole. So with that, I'm going to continue name dropping a bit, because I think name dropping is important and it gets you some goodwill at the start of the presentation, hopefully a couple cheers. But in this case, it's not just name dropping. I do want to say that it's incredible to be among some of my mentors that, frankly, a couple of them probably don't even know that they're my mentors. But let me talk about some of the obvious ones. Levi, I've been extraordinary. I've been an admirer of his work for the better part of 2 decades now. Not only his leadership at Jim Wavy, but his willingness to go into public service and to take the lessons learned in his leadership battles and use that to instruct others and other younger people. He is pretty old now. Younger people to kind of learn from the lessons learned and share that knowledge with newer generations. I've had a chance to work with them in developing relationships between business entities, Indian country, governmental entities, including state and federal governments, and I know that work continues. So his work at CAIED, as well as with the Rural Policy Institute, is certainly connected to his commitment to public service, and it's just great to see Levi here. In addition to that, I'm very humbled to be following Chairman Wood and Dr. Begay's presentation. Frankly, I was very tempted to ask if I could use their PowerPoints, just to regurgitate them and use the same PowerPoints, because they hit on some of the themes that I was planning on talking about. And in one sense, that really makes sense. I don't know if Dr. Begay remembers this, but before I went to law school, I think it was 1993 probably 1994, I was working for Fort McDowell, Yavapai Nation, and another visionary, Dr. Clinton Patia, truly believed in imbuing education and a commitment to service in the young people of his community. So he developed a college outreach program for his junior high and high school students to give them an opportunity to see themselves in leadership roles down the road. And he set up some college visits that included Harvard and Dartmouth, as well as other places on the East and West Coast. I was very lucky and very honored in my capacity as a culture and enrichment coordinator for the tribe at the time. I was asked to be a chaperone on those trips, to basically take the kids and make sure that I didn't lose them on the subway. Almost lost a couple. But when we were in Massachusetts, we took a trip over to the Harvard Native American program, as well as the project on American Indian economic development, and Dr. Begay was there. And I don't know if you remember that trip. And you know, he was talking to the kids, but he was also talking to me. I was only 21, 22 at the time. And Dr. Begay hit on many of the themes he talked about today in his presentation, in terms of not losing sight of the ultimate goal of economic development, not losing sight of the ultimate point of governance, and that is preserving who you are as a people. You know, whether it's the integrity of your land, or the integrity of your language, your culture. And he hit on those themes then. And he talked a little bit about using the tools of economic analysis, the tools of business, the tools of law, to help fuel those efforts. And that really stuck with me. And between that and discussions from my family, or with my family, and my mom and dad were heroes of mine as well as conversations with Dr. Patia, who encouraged me. At the time, I wanted to stay at Fort McDowell and help them develop their museum there, and I could have seen myself there for 40, 50 years. But he really encouraged me to go into business or law to help fuel the efforts to serve Indian country, to use some of those tools and some of the strategies from the business world, the legal world, to help empower those who are fighting the fights in terms of cultural preservation, language preservation, land integrity. And Dr. Patia had a tie-in with NAU. As many of you know, he studied business here. And so he always had a soft spot in his heart for NAU, and he made sure that Fort McDowell was connected to NAU, and I've always tried to stay connected, largely through my work with Levi, with NAU. So I'm honored and humbled to be part of today's Outlook. I recognize the importance of what NAU as a whole is doing and what CAIED is doing in terms of supporting tribal efforts to develop infrastructure, to develop strong tribal governance systems consistent with tribal goals and values. So let me talk a little bit about how tribes do that. So if there's a theme of today beyond Outlook, I think it was discussed earlier, that theme is about infrastructure. Currently, I am chairman of the National Indian Gaming Commission, and I, like all of my teammates at NIGC, we recognize the role that gaming has had, can have, hopefully will continue to have in terms of providing tribes the resources to fight those fights. But we also understand that gaming is part of a larger picture, a larger fabric. It's just one thread in the larger fabric that encompasses our collective efforts to really determine our future and not just provide for future generations, but provide in a way that is consistent with them being Chemehuevi or Yavapai or Apache or Navajo or Hopi here. So, and by the way, thank you so much for being allowed to be in your territory. I know we're here at NAU, but I know all those tribes that I mentioned, with the possible exception of Chemehuevi, but as Levi informs me, Chemehuevi believes everything west of the Mississippi is Chemehuevi land. But all those nations consider this home as well. And so thank you very much for being allowed to be here. But we at NIGC, we understand the importance of what we do, but we also understand that gaming by no means resolves the rest of, regardless of how successful tribes have made gaming. And let's be clear, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act didn't create the right of tribes to game. Tribes had that as part of their sovereign authority long before 1988 and before the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was passed. If anything, in some ways it was an infringement on sovereignty. It created a regulatory structure to ensure a role of the federal government and the tribes, and in many cases of the states, in regulating and protecting the integrity of gaming. Before IGRA, tribes could and did game with very little input from the states. IGRA provided a regulatory structure that carved out a role for states. So we understand our role at NIGC in supporting gaming, but regardless of how successful gaming tribes make gaming, that revenue doesn't alleviate the federal government of its trust responsibilities to Indian country, doesn't alleviate the federal government of its treaty obligations and other trust obligations to support important services in Indian country. And we see Indian gaming as just one piece of the federal government's responsibility to Indian country. By the same token, though, regardless of how successful Indian gaming is, I mentioned before it doesn't alleviate the federal government's responsibilities. Regardless of how successful given gaming tribes' operations are, it doesn't relieve our obligation as Indian people to make sure that whatever infrastructures we're developing, whatever economic development opportunities we're creating, whatever paths to success we're inventing, those paths, those opportunities, those avenues are consistent with who we are as a people. So gaming itself, just like any economic development opportunity, doesn't resolve us of the responsibility to ensure each step of the way that our governance decisions, our business decisions, our legal decisions are consistent with who we are as a people and where we want to go. So that's kind of the general theme of what I want to talk about today. Developing strong institutions, helping build strong institutions consistent with tribal goals and values. And for that, can we cue up Dr. Begay's PowerPoint presentation? I'm just joking. I'm just going to steal Dr. Begay's PowerPoint presentation because I think it covers almost all the themes that I want to address. But in keeping with how I like to present, as well as how I think many of us are used to speaking, I want to kind of share a story. And it may not make sense at first, but it's a story from my tribe. My tribe's the Muscogee Creek Nation. I'm Muscogee Creek on my mom's side. My dad's Bengali from India on my father's side. Well, that would make sense, he's my dad. They met in Oklahoma in 1952, and somehow we ended up in Arizona in the early 70s. And frankly, my dad's one of the few folks that's taught. He's taught at both ASU and U of A. Didn't make it up to NAU before he retired. He's 83, he's a retired professor now, but he taught American Indian policy and political philosophy. But this story comes from my tribe, and I apologize to those communities who aren't in storytelling season right now. I understand there's a time and place for that, so I'll keep it very general. But it's the story about why dogs sniff each other's tails, okay? And it's a story about that. I don't know how many folks are dog people here, but anybody that knows dogs knows that they sniff each other's tails when they first meet. And there's a very, very good reason for that. And I want to get the mic just right before we go into it. So, okay. Here we go. Okay. So the reason for that is because of our trickster. Most tribes have a trickster. Ours is Juffy. Juffy's a rabbit. And he was our trickster. And he was good friends with Bear. Bear Nogazee was kind of his protector. I like this story. I'm Nogazee clan, so I like sharing this story. And one winter day, Jiffy started to realize how skinny he was. And he would go over to Bear's house and have dinner with Bear, and sometimes hang out with Bear just because Bear was nice and big and warm. But he was always jealous of other animals who had nice, big, fluffy coats. Okay, but the more they thought about it, he said, well, why would I need a coat if I had fire? If I had fire, I could take it with me wherever I go. I could cook with it. I could warm myself whenever I want. And you know, all I need to do is get some fire. But Jiffy knew very well that the different animal nations held very, very close to the vest their knowledge of the secret of fire. And so all the different nations had it. Well, not all of them, most of them did. But Jiffy, because he was a trickster, he didn't really hang out with his fellow rabbits. He didn't really have access to any of that fire. So one day he hatches a plan. Bear's his friend. He's going to make an outfit and sneak into one of these nation meetings and steal some of their fire. So he thinks long and hard about whose fire he wants to steal. And he's like, you know, the Oba and the Ifa, the wolf and the dog, they're always chasing me. They're always chasing me. And those guys, if anybody deserves to have some fire stolen, and it's those two, I'm going to go to the wolf and dog meeting and steal their fire. So over the course of time, he develops some of Bear's fur, makes a fake wolf outfit. Fake wolf outfit, beautiful camouflage. And one night at the Wolf and Dog Council, at this time they got along and they'd meet together, he snuck into the council meeting and sat with them. So the Wolf and Dog Council was a very formal council. People would take off their coats, their dresses, I mean their regalia when they went before the council. And the dogs would take off their tails and hang them on a coat rack before they sat down to meet. Rabbit, watching this, took off his fake tail and went down there. And all the dogs were talking about business of the day. And when he thought no one was looking, Rabbit snuck up to the fire and started to steal some of that fire. And one of the dogs noticed him. Rabbit, being caught red-handed with his hand in the fire, didn't know what to do. He just yelled, "Yeah!" and ran out and took the fire and threw it around the council and just ran out, creating a diversion, scattered embers and sparks everywhere, and all the dogs scattered in a million different directions. And each one of them grabbed the first tail that they could get before they ran out of fire. And that's how Rabbit first stole fire, and then confused the heck out of dogs and wolves, so that to this day, whenever they meet each other walking along the street, they sniff each other's tails to see if the other one has their coat. And so that is the story of why dogs sniff each other's tail, but it's also a story of camouflage. Okay, it's a story of camouflage in terms of Rabbit wanted something. What was his goal? His goal was the fire. Okay, and he knew he had to walk in two worlds, and walk among another nation, walk among the nation of wolves and dogs, and you know, dress himself in the attributes of that nation to be able to get what he wanted. Well, you know, as many folks have looked at our efforts to engage in economic development in this, you know, in this current economic world, you know, there are a lot of similarities there in terms of learning the skills of commercial courts, the skills of commercial codes, developing land planning agreements, developing, you know, sensible business licenses that include waivers of sovereign immunity or include consent to jurisdiction. There are a lot of ways that we dress ourselves as Indian people, as tribal leaders, as tribal business people, to get the fire, to get what we need to keep us warm and provide, the future that we want. But there, like anything, like most communities, there are corollaries. There's a dualism in most Native thought, and so there's balance in everything we do. And for every story on one side, there's a story on the other. I'm not going to tell the whole story on this one, especially because it's a scary story, and I don't want to violate any taboos. But in our tribe, there's another story on the flip side of all of this about someone who sought to be able to change into the form of a certain animal that I won't disclose for the purpose of putting bad medicine on arrival. And that person turned himself into a certain type of bird. But fortunately, that rival had enough good medicine that he neutralized that effort. So that first person stayed a bird. And one day, somebody was out bird hunting and that guy got shot. He got shot in the context of a hunting trip. And basically he, actually not shot, he was shot with, it wasn't a gun, it was an arrow. But basically he was shot because he was a bird. People thought he was that type of bird, and he was fair game. So why am I telling all these long-winded stories? Where am I going with all this? What does this have to do with institution building, infrastructure building? Well, I think it's pretty obvious to some. It is important to learn the tools we need to learn, but what is it all for? If we lose our connection to what we were trying to fight for in the first place. As it was said earlier today, economic options are a matter of political sovereignty. That's why Indian gaming isn't about money, it's about political sovereignty, it's about economic sovereignty. The same can be said for any economic development endeavor. But at the same time that we're engaged in aggressive and assertive economic planning, we need to ask ourselves at each step of the way, how does this fit into our long-term plan as a community? Where are we going as a people? So let me backtrack a little bit and talk about how we understand that dynamic at NIGC. That is a dynamic that's already been addressed today in terms of, there's a Nietzsche quote that talks about that second story in a different way, but it's one of my favorite quotes. It's those who fight monsters should fear becoming monsters themselves, and when you stare into the abyss stares into you. So I'm not saying gaming by any means is an abyss. Gaming is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. We talked about the second story that had different uses of medicine, one good, one bad. Gaming, like any economic tool, is simply that. It's a tool. But how we think about tribes' efforts to engage in economic development and engage in gaming while staying true to who they are. We don't want to get in the way of that. We want to, as part of the larger administration commitment to nation building and supporting tribal economic development, self-sufficiency, and self-determination, we want to empower that while following the law. So this is the only part where I'm going to really talk about gaming and NIGC specifically, but my overall presentation is, again, building strong. I'm sorry, can we put it on the first slide? Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Building strong institutions consistent with tribal goals and values. I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. So the NIGC is a regulatory agency, and I'm not going to spend too much time going over this, but we were created by the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, passed in 88, and as I said, IGRA didn't create gaming, it provided a regulatory structure for that. And within our statute, the purpose of Indian gaming is set forth as intended to support tribal governments, through self-sufficiency, economic development, and just overall tribal governments. Well, the way that we see our best shot at doing our job and following the laws of federal agency while staying consistent with that balancing act that tribal governments have to walk is through our principles and priorities. And let me just go, this isn't the gist of my presentation, this is just something I wanted to touch on for illustration purposes. First and foremost, we have to do our job. We have to perform our regulatory duties under the law. Second, and this is where the rubber meets the road, in doing our job and performing our regulatory duties, we are going to we are committed to doing our job in active and meaningful consultation with our tribal partners. Third, we have to stay ahead of the technology curve. I think the gentleman from Wells Fargo talked about cyber attacks. Indian gaming is a technological industry. We need to have the internal capacity so that when we provide training and technical assistance, we know what we're talking about. Fourth, we have to support a strong workforce, both in-house and among our regulatory partners. We do thousands of free training events every year for Indian country without any cost to Indian country. But the whole point of that is so that tribes themselves can be continue to be the primary regulators of Indian gaming. And fifth, strengthening dialogue and relationships with all relevant stakeholders. So we've got a very good relationship with tribal governments, but we also need to deal with tribal regulators as well, and we do, as well as other regulatory partners. So how do we carry that out? These are my principles, but they're also our agency's principles. We act quickly, to address anything that jeopardizes the integrity of Indian gaming. Second, we act quickly on anything that jeopardizes the health and welfare of anybody interacting with Indian gaming. Third, the third and fourth ones are my favorite, and they really tie into what I want to talk about. But the third one is we engage in sound regulation without unnecessarily stymieing lawful economic development activities. And fourth, we protect against anything that amounts to gamesmanship on the backs of tribes. So the federal government as a whole, and NIGC in particular, has had a checkered history. NIGC, better than the rest of the federal government, I think, because it's a newer agency, but we've had ebb and flow in our relationship with Indian country. I think we're at a high water mark right now in terms of doing our job as an agency, but doing it hand in hand with our tribal partners so that we're not going to be creating artificial roadblocks to economic development. We're going to do our job to protect the industry and to preserve health and welfare, but we're not going to regulate for the sake of regulation. But in addition to that, we're also going to actively and aggressively address anything that amounts to a third-party threat to a tribe's ability to control its own operations and control its own future when it comes to gaming. So these are all consistent with our statutory mission, but we've tried to elevate certain points of the statute to communicate an overall philosophy of the agency. And that philosophy basically is, we understand that tribes have to, by merit of living in two worlds, have to wear a certain amount of camouflage, and there's nothing sneaky about it. It's just being able to speak the appropriate language, to be able to move in and out of the right worlds, but they also have a dual parallel goal, which is probably more important to that, and that is protecting where we're going to, who we're going to be. If any economic activity just boils down to some sort of just tax break or unfair advantage, that will soon be lost. But if we continue to tie our strategy with our ultimate goals of who we are as a people, that has legs that can live on forever. So at NIGC, we realize that we don't want to get in the way of any of that. We've got to do our job, we've got to regulate, but the real meaningful self-determination and self-governance that's coming from Indian country comes from all of you on the ground. So I had respect for Dr. Begay's presentation, or those points that he made long before I came to NIGC, and let me touch on that as well. In terms of having to walk that walk, the same considerations that we talk about in terms of business also exist in law. Sorry. I don't know what I'm doing in this. It's my bad. Okay, no, that's fine. So before joining NIGC, I was very honored to have served a number of communities as a judge or a justice. And I saw current leader of Bluestone Strategy Group, former chairman Jamie Fulmer in the back. I was very excited because Yavapai Apache Nation was one of the first places I became an appellate judge at. And I think Chairman Fulmer swore me in. But I also served, thank you, Mado, Chairman Fulmer, he's right back there. Also was honored to have served as Chief Justice for my tribe, the Muscogee Creek Nation. The same considerations that we have in business certainly exist in the judicial world. I think the idea of not having politics interfere with business decisions certainly holds true for the judicial world. Politics interfering with judicial decisions is a bad mix. So recently I was made aware of a quote by Judge Polly out in Washington State. She's a very well-known judge in that part of the country. And her quote, I loved, I'm going to repeat it, is separation of powers does not mean separation of solutions. The idea is you have you have the various sacred spheres of authority and activity, but together collectively you stay in your lane, but you work toward a common goal, keeping in mind a common set of interests. So an ideal situation in the judicial world is a healthy, functioning judiciary separate and apart from political decision-making. Same thing can be said for business. You know, the development of economic development authorities of various tribes, tribal economic development arms, tribal gaming, separate gaming operation arms. That has paid, that has paid off in spades for tribes who seek to foster a healthy economic atmosphere that isn't tied into the day-to-day political considerations of a given tribe. Well, the same is true when it comes to regulation. Federal government, we're an independent regulatory agency, fortunately not tied to the larger political process within the federal government. But that's important for us to do our job. We need to be able to understand the big picture, call it as we see it as regulators, but still understand how we fit into the big picture. So there are a lot of commonalities among the judiciary, regulatory communities, and business communities. And the common theme is you want to foster an atmosphere that is is attractive to economic development, but in doing so, you don't want to stare in the abyss too long. You still want to retain control over your ultimate future. And so, when I worked with Levi back in the day, we worked on development of commercial courts that were separate courts that allowed, by agreement, certain types of commercial disputes to be resolved in those commercial courts. And by and large, they looked very similar to state courts. Oftentimes, they were overseen by a retired state court judge. But they also applied the tribe's code that it may be a commercial code with many attributes of the standard uniform commercial code, but where the tribe saw fit, it injected its own values and its own decision-making into the process. That was something that we were very proud of when we worked on those issues together. Same can be said for development of commercial codes as a whole. We talked back in the day about business licenses and the fact that every tribe has the authority to issue business licenses within their communities, and they can insist on certain agreements to be in those business license applications or certain statements. And among those could be an agreement to handle certain types of disputes within a tribe's commercial court system or within a tribe's judicial system, or to agree to jurisdiction, tribal jurisdiction for certain types of matters. Everything's a balancing act because you still want to foster investment in your community. We also talked about the sensible use of sovereign immunity waivers, how the sensible waiver of sovereign immunity is sometimes an act, an expression of sovereignty itself. The idea, again, being at every decision point of a tribe or a tribal business, you got to decide, is the ultimate economic development benefit that I'll get from this approach going to in any way compromise our ability to maintain our goals consistent with our values? And so that's the ultimate theme that, that's the whole reason I shared those stories. I think that's consistent with what the incredible speakers spoke about today. But let me get away from Indian gaming as a whole. It really is a battle right now. It's a battle to make sure that we have the resources as Indian people to fight the political fights that are necessary to preserve sovereignty, jurisdiction, economic opportunities. But as we fight that battle, let's not lose sight why we're fighting it in the first place. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. I know everything I'm talking about I learned from all of you. But it is concerning when disputes can't be worked out among ourselves between various tribes. It is concerning when disputes ultimately get framed in the context of something that's not really consistent with who a tribe is as a people. Because whenever that happens, we have to keep in mind the secondary story of that bird, the person who turned into the bird, being shot because everybody thought they were a bird. And it's good to use medicine, but to use medicine intelligently and for good purposes, that's the key. So I think there's a path forward in doing that. The Chimwavy victory story is a true story of that in terms of fighting those fights and still staying strong and still staying true to who they are as a people. We in the federal government that care about tribal sovereignty and tribal tradition and culture, we're not able to really get into that fight because we're not, it's not for the federal government to say how a tribe should develop its own internal programs. But I can assure you at NIGC and within other offices under this current administration, we do understand that fight. We're committed to supporting Indian country in that fight. And many of us who are in the positions we're in, we recognize that it's because of the support it's because of support from all of you in Indian country, and we came from Indian country, and we're going to go back to Indian country when it's all said and done. So, in closing, I do want to open up some time. I mean, and this is a speech, but I always like to allow for an opportunity for Q&A. But just in closing, you know, I just wanted to say we're committed at NIGC to helping support that balance between engagement in economic development while staying true to yourself as a people. But if there's anything that we can ever do better, we want you to be upfront with us and straight with us and tell us. But tribes were the true economic development powerhouses, you know, of history, as we know. Just in closing, I'll leave you with this one piece. In my tribe, there are parrot feathers in some of our traditional ceremonial items, some of the old preserved ceremonial items. My tribe's from Georgia and Alabama and part of Florida. There are no parrots. There are no parrots in that part of the hemisphere. The parrots come from Central America, South America. We were the innovators. We had trading routes all throughout this hemisphere. As we know, the statements made about loss of land and displacement hold true. We went through a very, very difficult period of history, but economic development was our stock in trade. We were the great traders, and we had trade routes spanning thousands of miles. So what we're talking about today, when we're talking about putting on dog or wolf, you know, wolf tails, it's not because we're learning anything new. It's about adapting and adjusting to a changing situation. And I have faith. We're talking about the outlook of economic development in Indian country. I have absolute faith we'll continue to hit it out of the park in that area, because if there's one thing we've done well as Indian people, it's adapt and change and survive and thrive in the face of ever-changing circumstances. So it is important for us to learn how to wear different clothing, but we can always be bolstered by the fact that, hey, we're the ones who came up with this stuff in the first place. And so with that, there's an old saying, if you want to walk fast, walk alone. You want to walk far, you walk together. I don't know if I'm up here representing NIGC or the federal government or a former attorney, but in whatever role I'm up here in, I can assure you that the teams that I'm part of, we're committed to working together in that common goal of providing the tools that we collectively need to preserve meaningful, culturally consistent futures for our children. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. Thanks for allowing me to share some off-topic animal stories. I know it's out of season for a couple of you folks, but creeks, we tell stories all year long. So with that, thank you, and Mado.